So Easter Sunday's here, and it's not how any of us expected it to be, but that's okay. If you work in the church world, which I'm sure a lot of us do, it's kind of a big deal. It's kind of like our Super Bowl. You know, Easter, Christmas, it's the days when everybody comes out to something we really look forward to. So it's a little bit of a bummer that there's only one person here today. Actually, no, now there's three. My two kids are running around in the hallway back there because they don't go to school. But that's okay. We'll adjust. When I was growing up, if I'm being honest with you, when I was growing up, I just wasn't really impressed with Easter, at least the story of Easter. So when I was really little, we never really went to church. We go for Christmas and we go for Easter if somebody got married or if somebody died. So really every year I just heard the same two stories about Jesus, like over and over and over again. And I learned about when he was born and when he died, but when he didn't actually die. I didn't understand it to begin with. And what would happen is Easter morning, we'd wake up and the bunny came, and that's really exciting because he brings all sorts of cool stuff. And it's the only day of the year where you get the green light to eat candy for breakfast. And if you want eggs, you got to go find them. So there's a game involved too. Really cool, really exciting. But then the fun would stop. One of my parents would come in and be like, okay, it's time to get ready for church, which meant like stop eating candy. Now we got to rush and put on clothes that I don't want to wear. I didn't really like dressing up. Still don't like dressing up, in case you can't tell. And it just was kind of a downer, to be honest. We'd get to church right about the time that my sugar high was coming to a screeching halt, and then I would sit there and listen to somebody talk about something I didn't really understand. But at some point, you can probably guess, now I'm working in a church, at some point, something changed. And the thing that changed was that I came to understand the message as good news. Not just a good story, but good news. In fact, if you've ever heard of the word gospel, like the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Luke, Gospel of John, those are four versions of the same story written by four different people for four different reasons, but the word gospel just means good news. It means the good news according to Matthew or the good news according to Mark. And so the word gospel also wasn't even a religious term. Like if you were at war and you won the war and you wanted your people to know, you'd send somebody, a messenger back to the town or the city with the gospel to tell people that you won the war. It just means good news. It's something that made people celebrate. They were happy to hear. And there came a point in my life where this message went from being something that was kind of boring, that I wasn't really interested in, to something that really changed the way that I see my life, the way that I live my life, and honestly, something that I would not want to live without. So since there's nobody here anyway, we're going to try something a little different. I'm going to get off the stage. We're going to go on a little field trip. We'll play some nice music underneath it while we tell the story again. We want to make today special. In fact, it's not even a religious word. When it was So attendance right now, 0 at son of a gun. During the time that Jesus was around, the entire known world was ruled by this political powerhouse known as the Roman Empire. And the Jewish people, Jesus' people, they hated it. And so there had been these ancient stories of a hero that was going to come one day, somebody they referred to as the Messiah or the Christ. They believed it was going to be somebody who was going to save them from the power of Rome, from the Roman Empire, somebody who was going to give them their freedom back, somebody that would put things back the way that God intended them to be, or so they thought. And then there are these rumors going around that there's this guy who is giving sight to the blind, deaf are hearing. People who can't walk can now walk. And they think this is our guy. Our hero has come. And so if you know the story of Palm Sunday, they hear that Jesus is coming into town, Jerusalem, which to them was the holiest place in the world. So they have this miracle worker, this hero, who's coming into the most holy place in the world. He comes in on a donkey, and people come out by the hundreds. They can't contain their enthusiasm. They're shouting out, Hosanna, Hosanna, which means God save us. They're throwing palm branches on the ground. They're throwing their jackets on the ground, which was a big deal. They didn't have as many jackets as we did. And they're excited. They think our hero is finally here. Someone has finally come to free us from the Romans. So at this point in the story, Jesus is famous. He's like Justin Bieber famous. Remember, they had come out by the hundreds. And that week was kind of an interesting week. He went into the temple and probably lost a few friends by what he did over there, but that's a different story. He told a couple stories that a lot of the religious people in the community didn't really like. And so all his followers they're looking forward to Thursday. In fact, Jesus says he's looking forward to Thursday. And Thursday comes, and the reason that it was a big deal is because it was the day that they celebrated Passover. Now, Passover was like their Christmas. It was the biggest day of the year for the Jewish people. It was the day when they remembered how Moses rescued them out of Egypt. And so it's this big day of celebration. They're looking forward to it like we look forward to Christmas. And he gets together in this place called the Upper Room. And now we don't know much about it. We just know that it's upper, it's probably upstairs. He sits down with his 12 disciples, his closest friends, closest followers at a table. Probably not like this table, but work with me, we're in quarantine. So he sits down with them, and they know the script. Their people have been celebrating this for almost 1,500 years. All of them had celebrated it every single year. And what they do is at the dinner, they would take different things that they would eat, and each one of the things represented something. So they'd eat these like bitter herbs, and they'd say these herbs represent the bitterness that our ancestors had to deal with when they were in slavery, and each thing represented something. And so they knew the script. But Jesus starts acting really funny. At one point, he gets on the ground and he starts washing their feet. And this makes everyone uncomfortable. Some of them even said, like, I don't want you to wash my feet. It's weird, their feet are gross. And he says, I want you guys to love one another like I've loved you. I want you to follow my example. Okay, Jesus, thanks. Kind of a random lesson. But then he starts talking about how he's gonna leave. He starts saying goodbye to them. And the mood starts to shift. He talks about how things are gonna get really hard. They're gonna have tribulation. But he says, you can have peace. They're still not totally understanding everything that's happening. I mean, he just had this huge triumphant entry into Jerusalem. He's coming here to defeat the Romans. Things aren't lining up with what they thought. And then he does something crazy. He takes the bread, the unleavened bread, which to them for 1,500 years reminded them of how fast their ancestors had to get out of Egypt. And he takes the bread, he picks it up, and he breaks it. And when he did that, it probably got a little uncomfortable in the room. Like, Jesus, that's not what you do with that bread. Remember, they had all done this for like 30 years. And he says, this bread is my body, which is given for you. Do this to remember me. He's changed the script that's almost 1,500 years. He says, I'm gonna give my body for you. And then he does something similar with a glass of wine, a cup of wine, and he says, this wine is my blood, which is poured out. I'm gonna bleed for you. Do this to remember me. Then he says that one of them is gonna turn on him. And they start asking, like, is it you, is it me, is it you? And they're all questioning. Now everyone's uncomfortable. This night of celebration has gotten pretty dark pretty quickly. And then Peter gets up, he's the impulsive one. He says, there's no way I'm gonna turn on you. I'll go with you even to death. Jesus looks at him and says, Peter, before the end of today, before the sun rises, before the rooster crows, you're gonna deny me 3 times. So things have gone from triumphant to dark pretty quickly. When I was younger, my parents used to take us to the beach, and my dad would take me out into the waves. And we would go deeper than I normally would, where the waves were bigger than they normally were. And I wasn't scared, unless I looked at him and I saw the look of fear or uncertainty on his face. And I imagine that's probably what the followers of Jesus felt that night after that dinner. They had finished that dinner and the mood was starting to get dark, and it just got darker and darker and darker as the night progressed. They went to a place called the Mount of Olives, which is where they normally hung out. It was a comfortable spot for them. And on that mountain, there was a garden called the Garden of Gethsemane. And they went down into that garden, and down there they see Jesus like they have never seen him before. He's a mess. He's totally beside himself. He's anxious. His sweat, they say his sweat is like drops of blood, and he is just utterly distraught. Now, you've got to imagine what this is like for those disciples. This is the guy when there was a storm and they were on that boat and they thought they were going to lose their lives. This is the guy who was sleeping downstairs in the boat. And when he came up, he said, "What are you afraid of?" And he just calmed the storm. He was always cool, calm, and collected. And here, he is a complete mess. It's hard to understand how unsettling this would have been to them. We find out later that he was praying to his Father, saying, like, "I don't want to move forward with this plan, but I will. But I don't want to." And there we see Jesus, like his human side, more clearly than we see it anywhere else. And then there's this moment where Judas shows up. Now, during the dinner, Judas had left. And at that point, there were a lot of leaders that were jealous of Jesus, religious teachers, and they wanted him dead because he was messing things up for them and they didn't like it. But they couldn't arrest him in front of a crowd because the crowd would turn on them. So they knew if they wanted to arrest him, they'd have to get him alone. And they convinced Judas to do it for him. So Judas leads them to him in the middle of the night. And now Peter sees these officials coming to get Jesus, and they're armed, they've got swords, and they look like they're ready to fight. And you've got to think, now Peter's looking at these guys thinking, finally, I'm going to get to see Jesus flex his muscles. Remember, Jesus is the guy they think is going to be their hero, who's going to be their conqueror, who's going to give them back their freedom. And so Peter rips out his sword and he comes out swinging. He cuts off one of the ears of one of the soldiers. And Jesus stands up and stops him. Basically says, that's not how we're going to do things. And he heals the soldier. And then the soldier arrests Jesus and takes him away. Something about this just doesn't seem right. In just a few hours, that night would go from pretty dark to pitch black. They watched, those disciples, as Jesus was arrested, as he was pulled away. For the first time, nobody follows him. Of course, Judas had betrayed him, but Peter, remember, just a few hours earlier said, "I will follow you, Jesus, anywhere, even to death." Peter says, no, I never knew him. I never knew him. So they watched as he was beaten, as they spat on him, as they mocked him, as they had these phony trials with all these crazy claims. Even the governing officials were hesitant to sentence Jesus to death because they knew it was so crazy. They knew he had done nothing wrong. And yet somehow he finds himself the body that is limp, that is beaten, bloody, and they nail it to a cross. The Romans were masters in the art of human torture, and death by crucifixion was the most painful way you could possibly take someone's life. And that's how they took Jesus' life. It was a night of broken promises that Peter and his friends made to Jesus, but also it was a night of broken dreams for these men. You see, when Jesus died on the cross, so did the dreams of all of his followers. They had dreams of course, Jesus conquering the Romans, but he had all this talk of the kingdom of God and what things could be like one day. And all of a sudden, when your hero, when your savior, when your leader hangs there dead on a cross, your dreams die with him. And so these men, confused and scared, they watch their hopes shattered shattered. Jesus said those famous words, "It is finished." And it was. It was. So they packed up their things and they went home. This was not the way it was supposed to be. So Jesus dies and the movement ends. The movement dies with the leader of the movement. And this is not the way they expected it to be. They take his body and they bury it. They don't bury it in the ground like we do. They buried it in a tomb, which would have been almost like a little cave. They'd put bodies in this like a hollow cave, and then they'd roll a big stone over it. And there's a man named Joseph, a wealthy man, who had this tomb, and he offers it to them, and they put Jesus' body in that tomb. And then they go into hiding because they saw what these leaders did to Jesus, and they're afraid they're going to do it to them. So the next day is the Sabbath day. They have all these rules on the Sabbath. There's all these things they're not allowed to do. And so they stay in hiding on the Sabbath day. And then the third day comes. Now, Jesus had told all of his disciples that he was going to die. And he told them that he was going to rise again. He told them a bunch of different times in a bunch of different ways. My favorite way is the way that John records it. Jesus says, he breaks it down real simple. He says, listen, I'm going to be here for a little while. And then after a little while, I'm going to be gone. But just for a little while, and then I'll come back. When I'm gone, you're going to be sad. But when I come back, you're going to be happy. And he says, no one will be able to steal your joy. But they still don't get it. There should have been a countdown outside the tomb on the third day, like waiting for the sun to rise, waiting for the tomb to open, but there wasn't. Nobody was there. So these ladies go out to see the tomb, and they bring perfumes, like to take care of the body, to clean it up, to give him a proper burial, because the first time it was rushed. And they don't go expecting to find anyone alive. They go expecting to find a dead body, but when they get there, the stone is rolled away and there's no one in the tomb. They go back, they tell the other guys, Peter and John run ahead. They go see the tomb and they find that the tomb is empty. Jesus is alive. It wasn't what they expected. It's not how they thought it was going to go down. But he's not there. And what's cool is that Jesus meets each one of his followers exactly where they are. John needed to see the empty tomb. Peter needed to go in it. Mary needed to hear Jesus say her name. He does. Thomas, maybe you've heard of doubting Thomas, which isn't really fair because all of them doubt. But Thomas says, I won't believe until I see the holes in his hands. So I can put my finger in the holes in his hands. Jesus shows up on the scene and he offers his hands to Thomas. He says, here, Thomas, you need to see? Here. He meets them where they are, and each one of them believe. And from that point on, these people who were afraid, terrified, in hiding, would become some of the boldest people who would ever live. Almost every single one of them eventually would end up losing their life because of what they believed. But they wouldn't deny it, because they saw a man who they were sure was dead. 3 days later, they saw that he was alive. It wasn't what they expected. It didn't seem right. They thought he came to defeat the Romans. But instead, Jesus defeated death itself. From that day on, the world would never be the same. So here we are, back at the clubhouse. Hope you enjoyed the field trip. John, who was the youngest of Jesus' followers, he decides when he's an old man that he's going to write out this story. And we have that today. We know it as the Gospel of John, the good news gospel, good news according to John. And so here we are again. What makes this good story good news for us? Why does it matter? What makes the story about Jesus rising from the dead better than the story about Simba returning to Pride Rock, right? How does this affect me here today? Well, John writes in his story about that morning that he found out Jesus rose from the dead. He says that he and Peter ran to the tomb. He also includes that he beat Peter to the tomb. It's like best detail of the story. They get to the tomb and Peter runs inside. John stops though, because you don't just like run into a dead guy's tomb, but he's looking in and he sees the grave clothes and they're all like folded nice and neat. And then he decides to walk in. And what he sees is that this was no mess. This was no grave robbery. The person who left everything nice and neat. Like somebody was in there, woke up and walked out and left things very orderly on the way out. And John says that, I love how he explains it. He says, he saw and believed. That's it. That's it. And it doesn't say exactly what he believed, but the idea is that in that moment, everything fell into place. Everything made sense in that moment when Jesus rose from the dead. It changed everything that Jesus had ever taught his followers. Here's what I mean. Jesus said things like, don't worry, because your God, your Father in heaven, knows the number of hairs on your head. He said that he came to give life and life abundantly, or life to the full, or a life that is like rich, the kind of life you want to live. He said that there would be times when things got really tough, but he always promised that there would be a reward, or that in the end it would be worth it, like finding treasure. And when the guy who says that is hanging dead on a cross, and was put there by the people you thought he was going to rescue you from. All those statements, all those promises, they don't mean very much. Pretty empty. But when he rises from the dead, he totally backs up everything that he ever said. You see, in that moment, he proved that he didn't have to be hanging on that cross. He proved that he chose to hang on that cross. And what these followers of Jesus, what they would explain later, is that that was his way of demonstrating his love for us. As if to say, there is nothing I won't do to win your heart. So we could say that on the cross, Jesus proved the extent of his love for us. We could also say that in the resurrection on Easter Sunday, Jesus proved the extent of his power. You see, death, there's nothing scarier than death. There's nothing more unknown than death. There is nobody that is not subject to death. In fact, most of our fears, most of them can be traced back to a fear of death. It's something that nobody's immune to. Right now, like in our world, the death rate is hovering somewhere around 100%. It's something that we've all got to face. And what Jesus does in defeating death, in deciding I'm going to show them that not even death holds me, he's showing them that he has power over everything, that he is the one that can determine their destiny. And there would be times when things didn't look quite right. Like when he was hanging there on a cross and they're thinking, something about this isn't quite right. Maybe they're even thinking, maybe this guy isn't who we thought he was. But when he rises from the dead, he shows them, I am the one who determines your destiny, who has the power to determine your destiny. As difficult, as hard, as uncertain as things may seem, I am the one who determines your destiny. And in the cross, he proved that he is the one that you want determining your destiny. He is the one you want to trust your life to, because if someone is willing to give everything, to give up their body and have it broken for you, that's somebody who I want determining my destiny. And for the rest of these people's lives, these followers of Jesus, they went from living a what if life to an even if life. Meaning they lived, you could read the Gospels. They lived being like, well, what if the storm gets us? What if the boat sinks? What if we don't have enough? Well, what if this is a weight? What if? To all of a sudden, once Jesus rose from the dead, it was, well, even if the ship sinks, that's not what determines our destiny. Well, even if we don't have what we thought we needed, well, that's not what determines our destiny. We know that there is someone who has power even over death, and that's the person who determines our destiny. And so they live these even if lives. And right now, I'm standing in a room with nobody in it. These chairs are empty. And then I go home to kids who are not in school. And life right now, like I'm looking at it, maybe like you're looking at your life, like something about this doesn't seem quite right. The uncertainty at times can be overwhelming. Like, when are things going to get back to normal? Are things going to go back to normal? Maybe right now you're looking at your life like, am I ever going to go back to work? Are my kids going to go back to school? Am I going to have a job? Is my wife going to get to go back to work? Is my husband going to get to go back to work? Am I going to get sick? Are we all going to get... There's so many questions, and we can live in the what if. Or we can trust Jesus. Trust that the one who has the power over death invites us to put our lives in his hands. Can you imagine the freedom of living the even if life? Well, even if this is worse than we thought it was going to be, even if it gets worse before it gets better, even if I don't go back as soon as I wanted to, even if things look very, very different, the one who determines my destiny loves me enough to have his body broken for me. He's powerful enough to take it back from the dead. I want to leave you with this story. Almost exactly a year ago, I met somebody who literally changed my life. Pastor Wayne Griffiths used to be the pastor of First Baptist Church of Babylon. I came here to start a church, and I went around to the pastors in the community and introduced myself just to make sure they felt like we were coming alongside what they were already doing here. And when I met Pastor Wayne, he welcomed me with open arms. Right away, he gave me a place to do my work in his building because I was just a church planter with nothing. And so he opened up his building to me. So I started coming here several times during the week, and I'd do all my work here, and I'd stop and talk to him. And eventually we started praying together, started praying for Babylon together. And then we talk. Eventually got to the point where on days when I had a lot of work to do, I couldn't come to the church because we would just talk the whole time. He became a mentor to me pretty quickly. And one day I get a text message from his son, Kevin. And Kevin says, my dad's having chest pains. Can you pray for him? And I said, yeah, sure. And then that night, I got a phone call from somebody else saying that Wayne had passed away. And I didn't believe it. Just like that. He was there one day and gone the next. And I did Wayne's funeral and his wake. And I couldn't believe the amount of people that came in. Everybody had a story of how he was there for them. Everybody had a story of the kind of life that he lived. Everybody had a story of how he loved, of how he showed them how good God is, of the way that he modeled the kind of love that Jesus loved with. He lived the kind of life that people want to be able to say that they lived. The thing that I will never forget about him, the story I will never forget about him, is a story that his wife Terry told me. Their last conversation, right as he was about to be taken away to go into surgery on the bed where he would eventually pass away, he looked at his wife and he said, I'm going to be okay. But even if I'm not, I'm going to be okay. He lived an even if kind of life. And do you know how he was able to do that? He was able to do that because he believed something. He believed something that those early followers of Jesus believed. He believed something that we're reminded of every Easter Sunday. He believed something that could change our lives if we would believe it too. He believed that on Easter Sunday, the most loving being in all of existence, proved that he was also the most powerful being in all of existence, the one who determines our destiny. And you know what we call that? We call that good news.